When we talk about the functions of the nervous system, we talk about sending impulses throughout the body in order to communicate information. This screencast will dive in a little more deeply as to just how those impulses are actually carried throughout our body. As a reminder, this is the structure of a basic multipolar neuron. If you need to know more about this, check out the screencasts on neurons and their functions. Today, we're going to look at a number of different terms, all related to the transmission of the impulse across a synapse. These are some of the key terms we're going to go over before we can actually talk about the process itself. A synapse is a connection between two neurons. It can also be the connection between a neuron and an effector. So when you go all the way to the end, to the last efferent or motor neuron, you eventually get to an effector. That connection is also called a synapse. The connection between these two neurons is functional. They don't physically touch. It's as if I were to hand someone a piece of paper. I don't ever actually touch that person to hand them that paper, but I still gave them information. The synaptic cleft is the gap or the space in between two neurons. Again, when I say two neurons, it can be a neuron and an effector, but most of the time we're talking about two neurons. So the synaptic cleft is this light blue space here. It's the gap between the two. So then you have to talk about pre- and post-synaptic neurons. The presynaptic neuron is the neuron before the cleft, before the gap. The postsynaptic neuron is the neuron after the cleft. So the presynaptic neuron is going to be passing the impulse to the postsynaptic neuron. You can see here the impulse is traveling from left to right. So this one would be the presynaptic neuron. This one would be the postsynaptic neuron. So you have your axon terminals as part of your basic neuron structure. So the axon terminals are the little ends. At the very end of the axon terminals, it widens and you have these little knobs called synaptic knobs. These synaptic knobs are going to contain little vesicles, which are little pouches that hold neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are biological chemicals that are going to carry out an action. So they are very helpful with transmitting these impulses, but they are a biological chemical that's going to cross the synaptic cleft and produce a response. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So these messages are sent only in one way. So the neurotransmitters only cross from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. And then depending on the neurotransmitter, different things happen to it. We'll get into specific instances eventually as we talk about different systems within the body. But they only go one way. So they don't go backwards towards the presynaptic neuron. They only go from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron when they are released. And you can see they're stored in these little vesicles until they're released into the synaptic cleft. So how does transmission actually occur? So you're going to have the impulse come down the whole neuron and finally reach the axon terminal, or the synaptic bulb of the axon terminal. Once it reaches the very end, and you can see this bigger picture is what's in this little box, so it's just part of the synapse. So once it reaches the end of the axon terminal and the synaptic bulb, these vesicles are going to be triggered to release a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter is then going to cross this synapse, the gap, and bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, so on the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron. Then some effect is going to happen. So that effect might be that the impulse then travels down the next neuron, and it happens again and again and again and again. And so the effect might just be that the impulse is passed on, or there can be a different type of effect if we've finally reached an effector. So when we talk about common neurotransmitters, here's a list of them. They do a variety of different things. Some of them control emotion and mental health. Some of them have to do with blocking pain, allergic reactions, muscle contraction. They do a lot of different things. When we look at neurotransmitters, there are two main categories. They're excitatory and inhibitory. So when a neurotransmitter binds to the receptor on the postsynaptic neuron or on the effector, if it's excitatory, it's going to stimulate an impulse. It's going to make something keep happening. If it's inhibitory, it's going to prevent or stop an impulse. So again, the way an impulse is carried is that the impulse reaches the axon terminal after going down the whole axon. The synaptic vesicles then release a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter crosses the synapse, the gap, and binds to postsynaptic receptors in order to carry out an effect or continue the impulse.